Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us. Thank you for joining us on the program. As mentioned, Dr. Peter Ward, our guest today. Dr. Ward worked on earthquake and volcano risk for 27 years with the US Geological Survey. He played a key role in developing the U.S. National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program. His specialty is communicating earthquake risk to the general public and how to minimize earthquake loss. In 1990, he created and produced a 24-page magazine in 3 languages about the next big earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area. Are you prepared? It went to 3.3 million homes in Northern California, won 2 national awards, was featured on Good Morning America. To talk about earthquakes, a hazard you can live with, Dr. Peter Ward, our guest on the program. Doctor, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us.
Rick, it's a pleasure to be here.
This is really an important topic and one that a lot of people don't spend a lot, especially in our part of the country, probably don't spend enough attention to because we figure it's probably not going to happen here. It's not like I live in California. It's something I have to be aware of. Let's talk a little bit about finding out what the risks are to you, your family, your business, your neighborhood. How do we go about determining that risk element?
Well, today with internet, you can find out a great deal very quickly. For earthquakes in the United States, if you live on the West Coast, it's a big problem. If you live in eastern Missouri, central U.S., it could be a problem. If you live in Salt Lake City, or all up along the mountain front going up towards Jackson, Wyoming, and Yellowstone, earthquakes can be a problem. And so one can immediately get a map of the earthquake risk in the United States, and you can figure out what the issues are for you. And this is the same with any other hazard. With volcanoes, if you live near volcanoes, there's a problem. If you're in tornado country, there's a problem. And the best way to survive any disaster is to have a plan, to know what to expect, and to know what you and your loved ones are going to do when the disaster hits.
A lot of the information we're talking about with Dr. Peter Ward, our guest on the program, you'll find at an excellent website, which is very simple to remember, livingmoresafely.com. That's livingmoresafely.com. If you go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, you can link on directly and get all the information we're talking about on the program today, including, Doctor, at that website, you'll actually find a map that will give you some idea of what the probabilities are that you'll have to face an earthquake at some point in time.
Yes, on that website are a number of links to maps that show specific locations and what the risk is. There are also links to a number of preparedness brochures, including the one I did in San Francisco, that tell you what the risk in that area is and what you can do to reduce your particular vulnerability. What is important in understanding a hazard, and once you know whether earthquakes are a problem for you or not, is first you want to know whether the buildings you're in are safe, and modern buildings typically are safe. But if you live in an old brick building, you may have some problems. Or if you live in a building that's directly located where the earthquake would occur, on the earthquake fault, you can have problems. And these are all things you can research ahead of time and decide whether you've got a big problem or a smaller problem.
And again, a lot of the information at the website livingmoresafely.com. I know with a lot of the work that you did for the government and studying this has been used by structural engineers to design structures and lifelines. Talk a little bit about that, because I see pictures on the website of retrofitting where obviously we've gone back and we may have built a building 30, 40 years ago and found out now it probably is not going to withstand, as well as it's not up to code for current structures. Talk about that retrofitting and how we go about finding out if the office building we're working in is going to be secure.
Well, earthquake engineers immediately go off any time there's a major earthquake around the world, and they study the buildings. They study the response of the buildings. And particularly starting back about 1970 in California, we got a great deal of understanding about how buildings respond to earthquakes. And what's very important, first of all, is that the building be bolted to the foundation. If your home is old, pre-1950, it may not be adequately bolted to the foundation, and when the ground shakes, it falls off the foundation and gets destroyed. Another very important thing for earthquake engineers is whether your building is flexible. And if it needs to be a little bit flexible so that it doesn't absorb a lot of earthquake energy, but if it's flexible in the wrong frequency, you can actually get resonance and cause serious damage to the building. And so earthquake engineers design buildings to not resonate but to be somewhat flexible. The problem we find in Nepal or in southern China, where 10,000 people can be killed or even 1 million people can be killed in an earthquake, is the buildings fall down. They're made of concrete without a lot of rebar, or they're made of mud or sticks or stone, and they fall down and crush people. In our country, the biggest problems we have that way are old brick buildings that were built, say, in the 1920s, 1930s, where the bricks are the structural strength of the building. And when the bricks fracture during an earthquake, the building can tumble, and the bricks are heavy, and they kill people.
You know, it's interesting because so many public structures that we see, in particular schools, it's very expensive to replace schools. What's the condition of many public buildings, and I'll focus on schools in the country? Are they up to what would be considered modern code?
In many areas they are. When I retired to Jackson Hole, early 2000, we hired an earthquake engineer to come up and look at all the schools. And he noticed specific problems in all the schools. All of those schools have been repaired and are fixed. In many other areas around the country, there's been a particular emphasis on making sure schools are safe and hospitals are safe, and the firehouses will be able to get the equipment out after an earthquake. In many of the critical structures, there's been a lot of work done. Well, whether that's the case in your neighborhood or not, it's something you can check up with your disaster manager. Most cities and towns and counties have a disaster manager who worries about these kinds of things. And if you approach him or her, you can find out a great deal about the specific hazards in your neighborhood and what you can do about those specific hazards.
You're listening to This Week in America. Our guest on the program, Dr. Peter Ward, an expert in earthquake and volcano risk. The website that we'll refer you to is very simple and it's very straightforward once you get there. A lot of excellent life-saving information, livingmoresafely.com. If people feel like we're in an area where there really aren't a lot of earthquakes, I read a study recently in Oklahoma City, in Oklahoma, the state, 2001, 2002, they had 3 earthquakes. In 2013, 2014, 1,766. A lot of people in that area believe it's caused by natural gas and probably the fracking process. Talk a little bit about that and the causes of earthquakes. Those areas, you mentioned in California, we understand they're more prone to earthquakes, but really all across the country we could have earthquake potential, don't we?
Well, in 2014, there were more earthquakes in Oklahoma than there were in California. And what the problem is there is that there are 4 injection wells that they're putting large volumes of water, wastewater from different gas and oil operations at very high volume down in these waste wells. And this has led to a number of very small earthquakes. And as long as it continues just in the area where they're pumping, the chances are there's not going to be an earthquake that would do damage. But in this particular case, not far from those wells, there's a fault that trends east-west right through Oklahoma City. And if somehow pumping the fluid into the ground were to release the stress on that fault, now we could be talking about a magnitude 5 or 6 earthquake which would be felt and would cause some damage. There are a number of places where either through fracking or through wastewater disposal, there are small earthquakes occurring. And in most cases, they're on top of this. I mean, in Oklahoma, there are a lot of people there in official positions that are concerned about it and looking into the problem and what to do about it. In most cases, these kind of earthquakes are not such a big issue. But there is an area in southeast Missouri where there were major earthquakes around 1800, 2 or 3 major earthquakes that shook so hard they actually rung church bells in Boston, Massachusetts. And they could occur again. They're probably not likely in the next 100 years, but they could occur again. And there are also earthquakes in the St. Lawrence Seaway and north of Boston, going from the northern tip of Cape Cod northwest north of Boston. So we find earthquakes in just about every state in the Union, but the risk varies a great deal. And what's most important with earthquakes is we don't need to sleep in fear and live in fear of them. We just need to realize if they are a potential hazard for us, it might occur sometime in the future. And if that's the case, it's just prudent to understand what the problem is and what we're going to do about it, what we and our family are going to do. It's just like when a tornado is suddenly bearing down on you. If you don't get down in the below ground, you could be in serious problem. With an earthquake, much the same. There are preparations you can do that'll make your home safer, much less chance of you being hurt.
Let's talk about from a family standpoint. You talk about reacting, reconnecting, and recovering. Let's talk about that. What should a family do? What's the basis for putting a plan together? How do we go about doing that?
Well, one thing is to have a discussion with your family about what's going to happen if the earthquake occurs in the middle of the day and the kids are in school and mom is one place in the neighborhood and dad is at work somewhere else. And one, what are you going to do in that location to make sure that you personally are going to be safer? But two, how do you reconnect? That it's very possible that the phone lines will not be available if it's a major earthquake. And that how are you going to know that the other is safe? How are the parents going to get the kids to school? And how are we going to reconnect? And it's worth talking about the options there. Then there's the problem of once you reconnect, what are you going to do in terms of your home? Is there damage there? And what are the problems?
And you mentioned practice is important. I guess it's like everything else. If you have a plan in place and never walk through that plan, chances are you're not going to remember it when you actually need it. So practice is important to make sure everybody's on the same page and knows what they should be doing. Make it instinctive at that point.
If you haven't thought about it before the ground starts shaking, it's too late. You don't know what your options are. You haven't got time to think. You need to go forward with it. And it's very good to practice the plan, especially if you're at a high risk. And it could be, again, from earthquakes, from floods, from tornadoes, whatever. It's important to practice it so that you go into automatic mode. Disaster responders do this. They have exercises where they practice over and over how they're going to deal with different information coming in or out the neighborhood and decide where the resources should be sent immediately. And they do this because this is how they learn. The same with firefighters and police. So it's important in time of disaster that if you have practiced a bit, if you've thought about what you're going to do, again, you're going to be a lot safer and you're going to be a lot calmer getting back to a normal life.
Should we stockpile emergency supplies?
It really depends a lot on the situation you're in. Certainly emergency supplies are very useful. Here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, we have the problem that if an earthquake occurs in the middle of the winter, we may lose power, we may lose the telephone, any communication for a week or two. And so people have to have emergency supplies to essentially camp out in the winter. Similarly, in other areas, depending on what the risk is, this is what you want to think out when you develop your plan. What if we can't get to the grocery store for a week? Or what if the grocery store is unoperating or they were crushed in an earthquake? What kind of supplies would you like to have available and have those supplies?
Are there warnings available? We know with the National Weather Service, if we have a weather radio, we'll know when there's a tornado, severe weather moving through the area. Are there warnings available for us for earthquakes?
For earthquakes, once an earthquake occurs, we can locate it very quickly. And we can send out a warning ahead of the earthquake waves arriving at the site. This works especially well in Mexico City, which is built on an old lake deposits and it's mud. And when an earthquake occurs, a lot of buildings get damaged and fall. But the earthquakes in Mexico City are far enough away that it takes 30 seconds to 60 seconds for the waves to get there. And so there actually is a system in Mexico City that you can subscribe to. It'll ring your cell phone with a different message than you normally get. And you can get 30 to 60 seconds advance warning. In California, there are people trying to implement this, but the distance from the earthquakes to the most populated areas is much shorter. And so it might only be a warning of a few seconds. But then again, if you've planned ahead and you can even have equipment that gets that warning and automatically turns off your computer or automatically opens the garage doors or any number of things that you could pre-program, then there's a possibility you could reduce those kind of damage.
Our guest on This Week in America, Dr. Peter Ward. He worked on earthquake and volcano risk for 27 years with the US Geological Survey, played a role in developing the U.S. National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program. Let's reflect back a little bit on in the 27 years you spent, and certainly years after that, in looking into this. It really appears, as I'm looking through the website, livingmoresafely.com, we know a lot more about earthquakes, causes, and maybe some prediction models than I thought. How have you seen that progress during the time that you've been involved in this?
Well, I think some people may remember the Alaskan earthquake of 1964. It was the largest earthquake to occur in the United States in recent history. And it shook the ground for almost 3 minutes, which is hard for me to imagine because a 15-second long earthquake feels like an eternity. But as a result of the major damage from that earthquake in southern Alaska in the Anchorage area and going out onto the Aleutians, there became a national interest in trying to understand earthquakes better and reducing earthquake risk. And then with earthquakes in Southern California in the early 1970s, we began to feel a need for a national program to deal with earthquake risk. At the same time, we were observing things before earthquakes on just a few instruments that suggested an earthquake was likely to occur. And this brought up the idea of earthquake prediction. And in 1977, 1978, we developed the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program that was driven by the possibility of earthquake prediction, but also included earthquake engineering and a great deal of hazard preparation related to earthquakes. As the years went by, with that expanded program, we put instruments out in a number of places where earthquakes were likely to occur so that we could trap the earthquake and see these anomalies on many instruments and feel more confident about them. Unfortunately, the earthquakes didn't come to the party, and over the years, we had to move the instruments into smaller and smaller areas. And even when we put them in the Parkfield area where major earthquakes were very common, we still didn't get the information we needed. So we decided at that point we really should put the full effort into earthquake hazard reduction and to training people how to respond to earthquakes and to make sure that the building codes and all the buildings were built safely to respond to earthquakes. And in the United States, that's the case. In China, it's not the case. And they've continued with earthquake prediction, and they actually predicted an earthquake and got people out of the buildings before the earthquake occurred. But that still is not what we would consider a solid science. And it may be with some of the instruments that are now available, like with things like GPS, that this will come back into the scientific effort in this country. But at this point, we know how to be safe in an earthquake, and most people in the United States will be safe. They just need to learn which areas to avoid and which buildings to avoid.
Just a couple minutes left in the program. Whenever you talk about earthquakes, everybody says, I keep hearing about the big one. We hear it in the media, a new movie out there, San Andreas. How likely are we to see in the next decade a big one?
Well, the really big one we're worried about is the Cascadia earthquake that goes from Central California or Northern California all the way up to Vancouver Island. That earthquake occurred back in 1700. When that occurs, it'll be the biggest earthquake, certainly in the mainland U.S. It's not likely, highly likely. On the other hand, we said in 1990, the Geological Survey said in 1990 that there was a 67% chance of a major earthquake on the San Andreas or related to the San Andreas Fault, actually on the Hayward Fault on the east side of San Francisco Bay. And if that would occur within 30 years, 67% chance within 30 years. Well, we have 25 years now. When we estimated that in 1990, the damage from that earthquake would be over $1 billion, which would have made it the most expensive earthquake in U.S. history. Now the cost would be a great deal more, and it still may be the most expensive earthquake in U.S. history. So it is something to worry about. The Hayward Fault goes all the way from Fremont, Union City, Hayward, right through the football stadium in Berkeley, up through Richmond. It goes right through a very populated area. It breaks the sidewalk and the roads in many areas through there. That earthquake will occur. Whether it's going to occur in the next 5 years or in the next 20 or 30 years, it will occur. And there's been a great deal of preparation trying to deal with that earthquake.
Have you been in an earthquake?
Yes, I have. More moderate, not big enough to cause damage, but I've been in many, many smaller earthquakes.
Fascinating. It's an excellent, informative website, livingmoresafely.com. Our guest on the program has been Dr. Peter Ward, an expert in earthquake and volcano risk. The website, again, livingmoresafely.com. If you go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, you can link on directly to that website with Dr. Webb. He'll be back in the program. We'll keep in touch with Dr. Ward and have him back in the program, not only to talk about earthquake, but he's working on a book on climate change, and that I'm looking forward for that book to come out and a chance to discuss it as well. Our guest on the program, Dr. Peter Ward. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us on the program. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Once again, the website, very simple, livingmoresafely.com. Information at our website, thisweekinamerica.us.